Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this Friday lunchtime for another in the De Morgan Foundation's series of online talks and events. You'll notice that your cameras and your microphones have been disabled for this talk, so please do use the chat function if you'd like to ask any questions to our speaker today, or if there are any technical issues we need to address throughout the talk, as I'll be on hand, even though my camera will be turned off whilst our speakers giving the presentation, but I'll be here to be able to help. So again, thank you for joining us, and to those of you who've just come through from the waiting room for the De Morgan Foundation's Friday lunchtime lecture. This week, Heaven's Promise, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Spiritualism, which is kindly being delivered for us by Dr. Anna Maddison. She is a researcher and lecturer in history of art and English literature, specialising in the Victorian era. Her doctoral theses addressed the influence of Victorian Spiritualism on the work of the Pre-Raphaelite poet-painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Dr. Maddison has 18 years' experience in designing and teaching courses at university level for the University of Liverpool, for Liverpool John Moore University, and in a freelance capacity at other higher education venues and art galleries, including the Walker Art Gallery, the Lady Lever Art Gallery, and at Tate Liverpool. So just before I let her start, that's a very good opportunity for me to plug our current exhibition of William de Morgan's ceramics called Sublime Symmetry, which is on view until the 9th of January at the Lady Lever Art Gallery. But other than that, it's over to you, Anna. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Right, this subject is one close to my heart. As Sarah was saying, this was the research that I did for my doctorate, which I received in 2013, but actually began researching around 2004. So it's been with me for a long time now, and it's something that I'm returning to and looking to extend at the moment. So I'm revisiting the subject. So it'll be nice to talk to you about it today, and I hope you enjoy some of the ideas that we raise. Okay, so let's begin. Now, let me just turn off so I don't have to look at myself. There we go. I want to start with this painting, very famous painting, Dante's Dream by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And why I want to begin here is this is obviously a subject very close to Dante Gabriel Rossetti's heart, with him having the name Dante, which was, of course, given to him by his father, Gabriele, who was a Dante scholar. So, born Gabriel Charles Dante Rossetti, Rossetti has some interesting self-styling here by dropping the Charles and putting the Dante at the front of his name to closely associate him with the 13th, 14th century Italian medieval poet Dante Alighieri. So this subject on the dead beloved, and this is a theme that Rossetti revisited in many forms throughout his career. The idea of the beloved that has passed over to the other side and the longing for reunion in one form or another. So by evoking the subject from Dante Alighieri, which in this case is a reference to almost an illustration of the translation that Rossetti did of La Vita Nuova, or the New Life, by Alighieri, he accesses that kind of idea, because what we have here is a depiction of a particular episode where Dante, in the Vita Nuova, or the New Life, describes the death of Beatrice and how he is led by the figure of love to her deathbed, and he dreams of her death, and it's very distressing to him. So Rossetti has actually tied this very specifically to the Dante text, which he translated in 61. So we have this interesting connection between art and literature, and we have the theme of the dead beloved, because Dante's idealized dead beloved here is Beatrice Portinari, and she achieves a kind of mythical status in the writings of Dante Alighieri, appearing in the Vita Nuova as a kind of idealized beloved, very much in the courtly love tradition of the idealization of women. And also she appears, of course, in the great Divine Comedy by Dante, where she takes over from Virgil and guides Dante through his journey in heaven at the end of that text. And of course, that whole idea is supernatural of the Divine Comedy, Dante being led through hell, purgatory, and heaven. So already we have a kind of template for an interest in supernatural through Rossetti's accessing of Dante. But of course, here he's referring very particularly to text. Now let's have a quick look at this. So here is Beatrice Portinari, the idealized beloved of Dante. Here is Dante being led by the figure of love personified here. And rather nicely, Rossetti has connected the figures of Dante and Beatrice with the arrow, almost like the Cupid's arrow of love, and it moves from heart to heart, showing their love connection. Beatrice here, interestingly, a kind of composite of Rossetti's two most famous models, of course, his wife, Elizabeth Siddal, with the beautiful red hair, and Jane Morris, his friend and his lover for a time as well, wife of William Morris, of course. So this references the text, and we have some interesting symbolic reinforcements. So we have the apple blossom here, symbolic of life being plucked before it comes to fruit, so the young life being taken short, and also May blossom, which may refer to the time, the month of Beatrice's death in June, 9th of June, 1290 at 9 o'clock. 9 is a very symbolic number for Dante. And of course, we have the most obvious symbolism here used by Rossetti, the poppies representing, of course, symbolically death. But also, interestingly, with it being the source for opium, we have other connotations here, and it's traditionally associated in iconography with death and with sleep and dreams. But we're going to see how that kind of links into the context I'll be talking about today. So we have our kind of starting point, Rossetti's influence. Oops, sorry, just click on there. Rossetti's kind of main influence being Dante. And in fact, anything supernatural he did love. He talked about bogies and ghosts and really did love anything kind of supernatural. So there's a real interest here coming in many a way, really, as to how he kind of... But I wanted to start with that because that's kind of a main established subject that Rossetti accesses a number of times in his career. Now let's have a look at another one based on Dante, and of course this is the famous Beata Beatrix, or Blessed Beatrice, and it references the end of the Vita Nuova, where it says that blessed Beatrice who now gazeth continually on his countenance. So it describes Beatrice when she is in heaven, and she is considered a very blessed figure, very close to Christ and Mary in that scenario. So here Rossetti is depicting Beatrice, what he says, embodying symbolically her death, and she is almost accessing or prefiguring her own death. We have the figures of love here and Dante again appearing in the work, as we do with Dante's Dream. But here we have an interesting change, or an interesting shift for Rossetti, because this isn't, apart from its allusion perhaps to the last lines of the Vita Nuova, as I mentioned, it is not tied to text specifically. It's rather, what Rossetti said, a subject imagined out of Dante. So he has taken a kind of license to imagine something new which hasn't been directly taken from the Dante texts. So this gives us the sense that there's room for much more symbolism coming in, perhaps from Rossetti himself or from other contexts. And I'm going to look at this several times because, in fact, this is an incredibly rich text, full of references that we can talk about for a long time. Obviously, I won't be able to do that today, but what I want to do is revisit it a couple of times, looking at the different layers through which we can have a look at this text. So the first layer, of course, is the subject of Dante. It alludes to that medieval poet. It alludes to Beatrice Portinari and her blessed status when she enters heaven, and Dante's longing to see her again when he passes into the afterlife. So she here is seen almost in the tradition, Rossetti depicts her almost in the tradition of the ecstatic saints, which would be much more of a kind of Renaissance allusion. If you think about Bernini's Saint Teresa there with the kind of look of spiritual ecstasy. So it does tap into an art historical tradition as well as a literary one. Very interesting work. So we have the messenger of death here, same bird that we see appearing symbolically in Dante's dream, dropping the poppy, symbolic of course of her death, into her lap. So that's the first layer. We have of course Florence depicted in the background with the Ponte Vecchio, the bridge in the background, and there is reference to Florence having sat solitary at the death of Beatrice. So first layer, Dante. But let's move on, because we're looking today at a very particular context, aren't we? We're looking at Rossetti and spiritualism and how that impinges upon his work, or how that gives a kind of context, a shared context, which I'm going to introduce today, for certain imagery and symbolism and ideas that permeate his work. So let's get right to it and quickly establish, of course, that period of interest in spiritualism. Victorian spiritualism starting in the 1850s, if you want to go with the kind of well-trodden narrative in America with the Fox sisters, and coming over here very much with Mrs. Haydon, who advertised herself when she visited London as the sort of foremost medium. And immediately this became very, very popular. It spread across all levels of society, including, of course, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who also attended séances. Now, part of the reason why it spread so quickly is that it fell on fertile ground. We already had this idea of interest in mesmerism and animal magnetism and entering kind of altered states, trance states. So it's a kind of zeitgeist thing, really, for the West, the accessing of Eastern religions and all sorts of ideas, a kind of melting pot. So the idea of contacting, of course, the dead through various methods, allowing the spirits to communicate with those left on earth. So this is table tilting, where there would be a certain number of tilts to reply to a question, and also table rapping, where you would ask a question of the spirits and they would rap a number of times for different answers, maybe yes or no for table tilting and rapping. And also the planchette here, used, of course, to spell out messages from those beyond. Now, I want to briefly mention the Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, because his texts, Heaven and Hell, Interaction of the Soul and Body, Divine Love and Wisdom, and his spiritual diary were very influential on the development of spiritualism generally. Swedenborg purported to walk in the spirit world and was guided to see all the kind of particulars about heaven and how it's come about, guided by angels across the next world. And so those kind of ideas definitely permeated, coming from a more occult Western tradition into this melting pot that we see here from the 50s onwards as a kind of societal or cultural phenomena. Now, I want to look at this slide particularly to establish the nature of spiritualism, what it encompassed in the period. It's a very kind of catch-all term, in a sense, for many different aspects of ideas related often to entering different states of being, and in those different states of being, either being able to receive or affect healing, or communication with the next world in one form or another. But we also have this crossover of many disciplines, which we now see as much more separate, distinctive ideas, was much more of an enmeshed melting pot. So if we have a look at the slide here, mesmerism, of course, was part of that idea. One of the ideas in Victorian spiritualism was that spirits mesmerized the mediums, and that's how they kind of passed their information on. But we also have people doing shows of mesmerism, hypnotism, coined in, I think, 49 by James Braid, and the idea of somnambules or somnambulism, which we now, of course, think most specifically about sleepwalking, more of a kind of medical term. In the period, that term was much more closely associated with mediumship. So somnambules or somnambulas were often mediums who would go into this kind of sleep trance. We also have this kind of magnetic seances, the idea of animal magnetism, Franz Mesmer and all his experiments, very much feeding in to this idea. And even phrenology here, kind of connected with the seance ideas. So I want to re-establish that kind of aspect because it's crucial to understanding how people of the period, including Rossetti, accessed these ideas. Now in 51, Rossetti, William Holman Hunt and Millais, 3 founder members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, actually attended a demonstration by Dr. Marshall Hall of electrobiology, which is another one of these words that we associate with mesmerism and with kind of altered states. And it's interesting that that was accessed out almost as a kind of interest by Rossetti, more for fun. And we'll talk about his different levels of engagement in a moment. But I also wanted to show this because this is the medium Home, and or I should say Hume, it's pronounced, D.D. Hume, the Scottish medium who for a time was in America and then came to Europe and performed over 100 seances with some purported incredible feats, including levitation. We won't go into the veracity of that or not today, but just to say he's a very influential figure around a particular, not just generally Victorian spiritual, but around a kind of particular group that we can, in which we can locate Rossetti. So we have the kind of all the kind of mishmash of different aspects of these kind of ideas of Victorian spiritualism, and we also have the kind of showman, the medium as well. Okay. We also have many of the mediums being women, because there was an idea in the time that women were much more susceptible to being clairvoyant mediums because of this sort of gendered idea of female passivity and woman as a vessel. So the idea is she would be much more able to be controlled by the spirits. So mediumship was seen as something quite naturally feminine. And in fact, interestingly, Hume was seen as effeminate. So there's this kind of gender ideas in the period as well, which I'll just raise but not develop particularly. But just to show you here one of the most famous women mediums from the period, this is Florence Cook and her full manifestation form of Katie King, purportedly one of the first full manifestations that appeared in a seance. And there's an awful lot to talk about with Florence Cook and Katie King. I'm not going to go there today, but just to show you again as well that this is Hudson, who is a famous spirit photographer. But what we want to look at here, of course, is the trance state, where Hudson has depicted Florence Cook almost insensible, asleep. The conscious mind has gone and the spirit can manifest. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic. And that is the one aspect that really unites these many aspects of Victorian spiritualism. And that's the inducement of trance state and the ability, once in a trance state, to kind of see into the next world or access those beyond the veil. So we come to Rossetti. Nice quote here from Goldfarb's Spiritualism in 19th Century Letters. One belletristic group of people to express interest in the phenomenon of spiritualism were the artists, poets and essayists associated with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and chief among them was Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Interesting that they give him that kind of level really of importance, and I'll just dip into some reasons why he is today. But there were many other people around him who were interested not just in spiritualism but in connected ideas with Swedenborg, and we'll come on to that. I mean, there's Tennyson, the Brownings, Coventry Patmore, the Trollops, Thackeray, Ruskin, lots of the literati of the period, and artists too such as G.F. Watts. But we had this interesting really subgroup, because Victorian spiritualism kind of as tendrils reached across all society. But I think Rossetti's a really interesting case because his engagement with spiritualism went through many phases and exists in many forms. There was an interest almost in a form of levity and humour about some of the more showman aspects of, for example, the electrobiology show that he went to with Hunt and Millais. And also he held in his garden a big, had a marquee and had Bergheim, the famous mesmerist, come and do a show for him. At present, there was a gentleman called the Master of Lindsay who'd also been witness to Hume's levitation. So we can see Rossetti kind of part of this group. But he also accessed it in a very personal way. And of course, we're coming to a real crux point in his engagement with Victorian spiritualism when we raise the figure, of course, of his wife, the artist Lizzie Siddal. Now, I always like to put these two together just to indicate, of course, this wonderful kind of sincerity of the self-portrait by Siddal, a kind of realism and a serious kind of bid to be taken seriously as an artist here. And of course, Rossetti's many, many images of Siddal, very idealized, with her heavy lids often emphasized, many a time depicted as almost quite an ethereal figure, dreamy, and that together with her excessive kind of thinness or slimness had a kind of ethereal, otherworldly quality that he played up in his pictures of her. So already a kind of idealization of his wife, and really one of his major models. Now, this is the crux that turns him, because in 1862, of course, we know that his wife Siddal dies of a laudanum overdose, 62. Now, he had been already working on some idea of a new subject from Dante from about earlier in the 1860s, and really after the death of Lizzie, kind of honed in on some earlier sketches that he'd done, and early kind of prototype ideas for this work. And we know that by 1863, 62, 63, he had already kind of formulated an idea of this subject, as we know from a letter to the patron Ellen Heaton. So this is where we come to that second layer, because following the death of Lizzie and the production of this work, it almost becomes a memorial to Siddal, and this is very much how it plays out as well. So we have, this is first a subject from Dante alluding to the text but not illustrating directly, and very much kind of that body of work about Dante, but it's also a memorial portrait to Siddal. And we can see that when we have a look at some of the symbolism, which I'm sure you may be familiar with if you're familiar with this work. Much has been said about this being both a picture of Beatrice, but how Rossetti kind of casts Siddal as his Beatrice to his Dante, if you like, a kind of mythologizing about their relationship. But much has been said here about the poppy, with it being the white poppy. Rossetti may be alluding much more to the trance state associated with narcotics, because of course it was a laudanum overdose, an opiate overdose, that Lizzie died from in 62. So clearly as well, much mythologizing that kind of ethereal quality that she had as a model and the way he depicted it anyway. So this is a kind of biographical reading. And that works too, as many critics have suggested that the bridge here may, in this reading, be Blackfriars Bridge, which had kind of similar kind of arches. And Rossetti lived in Chatham Place, which was just by Blackfriars Bridge. So it becomes an interesting text with layers already. It's a Dante subject, but it's a kind of memorial portrait. It might have symbols that relate to Dante's text. It has symbols that relate to Siddal and Rossetti personally. So following her death, this is when Rossetti immersed himself in a kind of more serious and personal way into the world of Victorian spiritualism. I have a quote here from Dunn, who was Rossetti's studio assistant. Rossetti thought he would have little seances at his own house, and from time to time a few others would gather together to have their own experiences on the matter, and on these occasions the spirit rappings and gyrations of the table would be carried to the uncanny hour of midnight. I believe on 1 or 2 occasions some rather remarkable messages were sent by the spirits which could not well be accounted for. Now this is interesting because we see Rossetti coming through, we see Siddal coming through a number of these seances, both those held with other people and also mostly those held in his own studio with his brother, sometimes with Fanny Cornforth, his mistress, and others. So there's a number of times when they are conducting these seances in Rossetti's studio that Lizzie purports to come through when they attempt to contact her in the next world. And I think rather poignantly, I'm going to quote from one in particular, which was in 1868. And of course, this is the period that he is working on the work. Rossetti took over the questioning in this seance of 14th of August 1868 and says, "Are you my wife?" in response to some of the initial communications that were happening. And the spirit replied in the affirmative, and Rossetti asked the following questions with the following responses. "Are you now happy?" "Yes." "Happier than on earth?" "Yes." "If I were now to join you, should I be happy?" "Yes." "Should I see you at once?" "No." "Quite soon?" "No." "Tilt the table to the person you like best." And it tilted to Rossetti. So we have this real kind of engagement and attempt to contact Lizzie. She was clearly on his mind throughout the period of the production of this work, because also this is the period of her exhumation in 69, where Rossetti had her casket brought up and the manuscript of his poems retrieved from her casket that he had placed in there before her burial, which of course is a very macabre and well-trodden kind of story about Rossetti. And there are other things as well, which we can go into in much more depth, but we haven't got time to today. So we want to think of kind of the sadness around this and why this kind of, I think, entrenched much more personally in Rossetti, because of the idea that she may have killed herself due to suffering from postpartum depression after the stillbirth of a child in 61. So the need in him perhaps to have a kind of reassurance that she was at peace now was, I think, one of the driving factors behind this attempt to communicate. But let's move on. So again, I talked about his engagement being kind of multiplicitous or